All right, good morning.
Good morning.
So I'll give you greetings of peace in the Islamic tradition. Assalamu alaikum, which means peace upon you. And say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the beneficent, the most merciful. So when you start anything, you say in the name of God. So the intention is at least that it comes out right. But I'm going to start, before I start on the exact remarks, a little Sufi kind of opening. So I'd like everybody to just relax and put your feet down and just kind of breathe. And think, I'm going to give a definition of one of the pathways, the names of Allah, Ash-Shahid. And as I give you the definition, just breathe it in. And then I'll tell a cute little story, and then we'll get to the topic of the day. All right, how's that?
Sounds good.
To have your permission to proceed?
Yes.
I think there's one or two of you that might be younger than me, so I just. Okay.
I don't think so.
I know. I turned 71. Does that make me the baby?
Yeah.
No, she the baby. She the baby.
baby.
She the baby.
Lisa.
Oh, you're, oh.
And Lisa.
Oh,
Lisa,
okay.
Lisa back there.
Oh, well, that whippersnapper in the back of the room.
Yeah.
With all respect, you know that, right? Okay. And if I get a little silly, I was a child my mother said would show up. She said I'd never grow up, but I would show up.
I like that.
So as you're guided into this path of Ash-Shahid, take the opportunity to think of the ways as you move forward through the week to speak and act from your experience of the reality, the one God, is shared by all beings.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So as you move through the week, think of how it's we all share. So, and then here's a little. Manjun knocked on Layla's door. Who's there? It is I. Go away. There is no room here for you and I. Manjun retreated to the forest and meditated for a long time and then returned. Knock, knock, knock. Who is it? It is you. Ah, the door opened. There are many other pathways that are part of life's diversity, the you and the I, and that serves a purpose. Yet the present one offers us deeper view, the wider picture. A moment of such direct experience of unity alerts us to settle for nothing else. Breathe through your heart and allow for all your being to reconnect to the understanding of unity. All right, now this is where I shift gears. I'm a historian, and so I always have to give a history. All right? So if you didn't like that class, don't worry, I'm not giving you a test at the end. All right? I know, she cringed. She was like, oh, history, oh. Math she would take, not history. Okay. But today I'm going to offer this story as to give you another angle of vision. You know how you've heard the people that I'm going to mention, you've heard of them before, and you heard of them in little distinct boxes and not in conversation with each other. So as I'm telling you these stories, I want you to picture that these were people in the room. Because you see, think about your own life. It's not just you, right? You have all these groups that you interact with, people you have conversations with, places that you go and interact with. You don't live in isolation. So when you go back and look at historical figures, particularly ones that had significant roles in the journeys of faith in the world, don't look at them just from the one layer. I always tell my students, And when I advise people at work, what's the story behind the story? My mother would say, you'd come in and you'd explain why you were late from that party. You'd climb up the stairs and you thought you knew the stair that wouldn't creak, but you stepped on it anyway. And mommy would be standing at the head of the stairs. And she said, I don't want the story. I want the story behind the story, right? In other words, go deeper, right? So today's presentation is to share a bit of how we can look at some of these historical beings, and instead of seeing them in opposition or adversaries of each other, though indeed they were, we can dare to understand that there's more to the story. Like I said, what's the story behind the story? And how does this new knowing allow for an expansion of your heart? You see, allowing for the expansion creates greater possibilities of peace. I believe it does. In Islam, we're taught that as believers, we're caliphs, we're stewards of the earth. It's our responsibility because every aspect of the earth, every being on the earth, every element of the earth is sacred. And so that as a believer, I can't walk with a closed, tight heart because then I'm not fulfilling my obligation as a steward to the earth. So as we expand your vision today, think about how do we transcend walls of conflict? How do we revisit history to get a greater sense of things that were done? It doesn't mean that the lesson and the learning stopped then. It means that maybe we weren't paying attention to all of it. Now, for the record, although I will highlight men in my storytelling, I do so for the sake of time, because you're not taking my history class this semester, okay? So you're not gonna be with me all day. I got about 10 more minutes, as a matter of fact. Now for the record, although I highlight the men, I do so in the sake of time, and I do not purposely exclude the women, because for all the stories we read, it wasn't just the men, you understand? Mm-hmm. But the women's story is another day, okay? It does not mean then that we have to block the lesson of what I'm telling you. Draw whatever wisdom resonates with you, assists with you, that's your lesson for today. Draw from that. Anything you don't want to hear, that's okay. We're working to create better understanding of each other across religious and cultural frontiers, rather than remaining within the colonized boxes and limitations on how we acknowledge the sacredness of the earth. And so it was challenging perspectives, things that I read. I'm gonna take you to the medieval times, like 1000, 1100, 1200. That was before we were born, all of us, right? And I'll share 2 examples of connections during the history of the Crusades. Now, okay, I know you know what the Crusades were: a series of religious wars initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Christian Latin Church in the medieval period between 1095 and 1291, with the intention to conquer and hold Jerusalem and its surrounding area from Muslim rule. Sometimes the Christians had the rule, sometimes the Muslims had the rule, and they continued to fight during that entire period. There were a total of 5 crusades. I'm going to give you snippets of characters from the 3rd and the 5th, and you'll understand how what you do in one generation can influence the next generation, because it was what somebody did in the 3rd that offered guidance to the Sultan that did something in the 5th, which then led to, well, stay tuned. So, in regards to King Richard, the Lionheart of England, and Caliph Saladin, the 3rd Crusade was fought between up to about 1192. In the late 12th century, a vast area covering Egypt and Syria was in the hands of the new ruler, Saladin, and he showed his power in conquering Jerusalem in 1187. Stay with me, all right? I know this is, she's like, what, history? Okay. After the conquest of Jerusalem, he also showed his character as a warrior who did not take revenge for the Christian massacres that had occurred earlier, because he let all the Christians that wanted to, they could leave peacefully. So though he conquered Jerusalem, he didn't then slaughter everybody, but rather those who wished to leave, he let them leave peacefully. But because of that, the rulers in France, Germany, and England were not very pleased. And so it initiated what we know as the Third Crusade. Now, here's the element, things I want you to take away. This is what, I'm gonna point this out. Take away, he did not seek revenge. So think about, as you're looking and working towards peace and unity and restoration, when you step back and don't seek revenge, all right? So it's, okay? So think about faith in relationship to character and the style of leader that I'm talking about today. So, and the reason why I wanted to talk about them, because first 18 years of my life, I was raised Episcopalian, and one of my things I love to read about was St. Francis of Assisi, all right? And I loved reading about St. Francis and his teachings. And that kind of stayed with me in a little compartment, right? And even as I became a Muslim, I would still read about St. Francis. So think about the internal conversation that you can have. So that's the whole reason why I'm telling you this story today. You thought you knew all about King Richard. You thought you didn't even know about Caliph Saladin. Maimonides, you're talking about a Jewish guy too, and St. Francis? The Protestant, the Christian, the Catholic, the Jew, the Muslim, all within a landmass. Jerusalem was not bigger than Brooklyn. So think about thousands of people being killed, multiple wars, all kinds of stuff. But think about how they were influencing each other. And that if we read them in conversation with each other, maybe we would have come across with greater lessons. Am I making sense?
Yes,
You sure?
I believe so.
Okay, all right. You know, I just want to know. And the ones on Zoom, like, I hope you're with me. You know, you can give me a thumbs up too. I see you. All right. So, Saladin was considered and admired even by all his adversaries, because he was very chivalrous in his behavior. He would reconquer land, but he would always negotiate treaties that allowed the Christian pilgrims to either visit there, live there, or leave peacefully. All right? Because he said that is what his faith taught him to do. So imagine having to, you're fighting, but you're still trying to find a righteous path. I mean, we go through stuff like that every day. You know, we run for the seat on the bus, but we really should let the other person get it, you know. Little things like that influence. I know I do it all the time. Okay. So, the most decisive conflicts in the Third Crusade were between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart was determined to take back Jerusalem from Saladin, and he eventually did in 1191. But as he finally marched on Jerusalem, there was a lot of things he could have done when he took it over, but he admitted to his enemy, I am too tired, I am too exhausted to fight anymore. And so Saladin's reaction was to send fresh water and supplies to King Richard's army as they took over Jerusalem.
Unbelievable.
See, when you start looking for the story behind the story, so think about when are those ways in our mission for peace, how are we, even if it appears that you might be my adversary, but today you didn't pray for just the homeless that you knew and liked. You prayed for all the homeless. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Are you still with me? Are you all right? Okay, I'm just checking. I don't want her, you know. So, because she got on a pretty top and everything, you know. As a strict Muslim, Saladin agreed to the request and gave fresh water and supplies, believing he was required to help even an enemy in need. He offered the services of his personal physician, a significant gesture given that Islamic medicine at the time was considered more advanced than anything in medieval England. That physician, his personal physician, Maimonides. Maimonides' family had been forced out of an area, ended up settling in parts of North Africa, living in Egypt. Maimonides lived most of his entire life among Muslims. And he was the personal physician of Saladin and also influenced generations of that family. When you would hear about Maimonides as the father of medicine, you didn't hear about who he lived among, who he socialized with, the relationships he had. What's the story behind the story? All right? And then what is the lesson we can draw from that? Once they sighed, when Christians were allowed, whether it was under Muslim rule, the treaties specified that pilgrims should be permitted to come and go. So it wasn't that we're going to block someone out and prevent. And that the interesting thing about Maimonides is that we didn't learn, in a lot of the earlier Jewish traditions, they didn't write biographies. So they were able to pull the nature of his relationships through his personal correspondence and letters. So if you want people to know who you really are, let them read your letters. If you don't want them to really know who you are, don't let them read your letters, okay? But he lived his whole life among Muslims, and the Muslims were the most prominent and prolific figures in medieval medicine. So the influences that we see, because Maimonides, through his influence with the Muslims, he was able to come up with his medical treatises such as hepatitis, diabetes, asthma, pneumonia. It was the consciousness and the wisdom that was generated through two different faiths, but pulling it together for what? The common good. So if one group wants to assume, well, it was only from because of, what's the story behind the story? All right? Maimonides lived in a community. He didn't live in a vacuum. Okay? So it just gives you something to think about, doesn't it? What about it? Gives you something to think about?
Definitely.
All right. So now I'm going to give you the story about where St. Francis comes in, and he approaches the Sultan of Egypt. Now, this is 2 crusades later. This is the 5th crusade, the last one. Okay? Now, these crusades occurred and thousands of people would be killed. And last night I was thinking about that, and I said, that's the sad part. But can you just imagine, how do you pull together these huge armies? They didn't have social media. You know, so think about how humans had to communicate, deliver messages, exchange information, and they did so very often across enemy lines. But I always think about the thousands of people that wouldn't live just because someone said, you cannot pray here. Christian, Jew, Muslim, you cannot pray here. All right? In the midst of the Crusades, the Sultan of Egypt, Malik Kamal, who was a nephew of Saladin, all right? So, remember Saladin? Okay, his nephew then he's in control, right, in Egypt. And he said, whoever delivered the head of a Christian would be rewarded with a Byzantine gold piece. Fighting had been fierce, and the Sultan wanted to put a definitive end to the conflict. By August 2019, his army succeeded in defending the stronghold of Damietta, killing about 5,000 crusaders in the process. God help their souls, right? Then came he was not Saint Francis then, but he's Francis of Assisi, right? Francis and Brother Illuminatus boldly went across the battle lines unarmed and were quickly captured by the Sultan's army and badly beaten. However, they spared their lives and brought them before the Sultan. The Sultan asked them by whom and why and in what capacity had they been sent and how they got here. But Francis replied that they had been sent by God, not by men, to show him and his subjects the way of salvation and proclaim the truth of the gospel message. When the Sultan saw his enthusiasm and courage, he listened to him willingly and pressed him to stay with him. It is said that Francis greeted the Sultan with the greeting, "May the Lord give you peace," similar to the traditional Muslim greeting of Assalamu alaikum, or peace be upon you. This surprised the Sultan, who quickly was enraptured by Francis's holiness. So who you are, your spirit, your faith, sometimes will open the door. Remember it? There's no room for you and I, right? Francis proceeded to preach the gospel to the Sultan in such a way that Kamal was not offended, and he did not end Francis's life for blasphemy. The Sultan could see the love that flowed from Francis and was astonished by his boldness. They spoke together of the spiritual life and reflected on each other's traditions. So you could still come together in conversation. It doesn't mean that I have to destroy you if I view your spirit. Make sense? Does this help any? Okay, just checking. I don't want her to throw me out, The two friars stayed in the Muslim camp for several days and departed on peaceful terms. Before they left, Al-Kamal wanted to give Francis lavish gifts, but Francis refused according to his vow of poverty. This too left Kamal speechless, as he was not aware of a man who refused earthly honors. Francis eventually accepted the single gift of an ivory horn that is currently still on display in the Assisi. The encounter changed Kamal, who gave safe passage to St. Francis and his companions and began to treat the Christian prisoners of war with surprising kindness. The Sultan proceeded to negotiate for peace with the Crusaders, asking them to leave Egypt. But the effort failed, but he tried again. And then eventually they came to what they called the 8-year agreement. Now, I mentioned earlier Saladin and King Richard Lionheart, and they, for many years, were exchanging communications back and forth, regular communications. Even in the height of fighting, they would still find ways, because they respected each other in terms of who they were, and they considered each other advisors of each, okay? Now, here's the thing. Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, they never actually met. So think about the power. When you think about who you can influence, whose lives you can enrich, it doesn't always mean that you have to meet the person. What is your works? How do you communicate? What are you sharing? What information are you sharing? Could still have the influence. Does this make sense? Checking in, folks. So, what do we learn? And what stays with me is that, and this is from the teachings of St. Francis, but it is also exemplified by the examples of Regardless to who he was Jewish, Maimonides. When called to heal, he went to whatever community he was called to heal. When Saladin, though he was a warrior and it was his job to fight wars, he still remembered the humans that would be impacted by those wars, and therefore then came to understand slaughtering the ones that you have overcome does not give you true victory. Through the lessons that can be extracted from St. Francis' teachings, from his life, from the teachings of Maimonides, Saladin, and Richard the Lionheart, and Sultan Kamal, we are challenged, each of us, to be present each day of your life. Be present to ourselves, be present to one another, be present to all creation. By being present to all around us, we are therefore then being present to the God who created us all from God's abundant love. St. Francis' writing talked of a mission of peace. Saladin said, be mindful of my faith and my prayers. Richard the Lionheart was humble enough to say, I am tired, I cannot fight anymore. And Kamal said, do not hurt the ones who is weaker. Those are the lessons. That's what I offer today as we endeavor to fulfill our missions of peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.